Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Brady.
And good morning, Joe.
Morning, Brady.
Last weekend, we saw anti-immigration rallies take place across the country. The rallies were attended by politicians as well as neo-Nazis. They attracted a lot of media attention in the lead up, but I still think a lot of people would have been shocked to see Nazis marching through the streets of major cities. How did we get here? Why are Nazis marching through Australian cities?
Yeah, good question. You're right. It's profoundly shocking. We saw people screaming, deport them to other Australians. We saw people allegedly being bashed in trains after these rallies, Indigenous Australians being bashed and assaulted. I think a lot of Australians will be wondering, where did this even come from? And I think, there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll be doing that throughout this discussion. But, in a way, it's as old as time. I think right-wingers and racists and Nazis use misinformation and concerns to foment anger against immigrants. They blame immigrants for house prices or lack of infrastructure or whatever else they want to put on the list. There is still a cost of living crisis. There is still a housing crisis. So there are some Australians kind of receptive to those ideas. It also plays into the move in the right of the coalition to try to use this sort of nativist uprisings around the world and emulate them here. It plays into the agendas of some media organisations. This has been a hot topic in Australian politics for a really long time. Some polls show that more than 50% of Australians think immigration is too high. So it's this volatile issue that a group of people have tapped into. But I think on the other hand, we need to be a little sanguine about it. Like the rallies might have attracted at most 50,000 people. They're not huge, but they are fomenting, often with misinformation, a concern that is there. So I think how we do this debate now is incredibly important.
Yeah, I guess I'd echo Lenore there, in that I think this fits into a long continuum of violence against migrants, violence against Indigenous people throughout Australian history, like going back to riots attacking Chinese mine workers in the 1860s. For people of my generation, it's very evocative of the Cronulla riots, which was, hugely formative moment, 2005. Just disgraceful violence that was also somewhat enabled by the mainstream media at the time, and sort of a lot of politicians kind of used quite pussyfooting kind of language about that sort of disgraceful episode then. So in a way, this is sort of not a total aberration in Australian history, but it was also quite specific to this moment, I think. Ariel Bogle and Nino Bucci, two reporters, wrote a really good piece this week looking at where this had sort of come from. This had part of its genesis in a kind of an online far-right reaction to the March for Humanity, the March for Gaza that we saw last month, when hundreds of thousands of Australians turned out to protest the slaughter in Gaza. And this was sort of a far-right sort of backlash that, no, we should be protesting for, real Australians or something like that. So it was both, and then it sort of fermented in these online networks, spread into more mainstream media, and kind of blew up from there. So it's both very much a sign of the times, but also, I think, part of Australia's identity and history, unfortunately.
And what about the government and the opposition? How did politicians react to these rallies in the wake of them?
Some politicians actually attended, like Pauline Hanson, John Ruddick, Libertarian New South Wales MLC. Mainstream politicians generally kind of use the good folk led astray kind of line. That's how Albo characterised it. There's always good people who turn up to demonstrate their views on issues, but then we saw neo-Nazis being given a platform. It's sort of how Susan Lee characterised it as well. I don't think that really washes. The racism was pretty clear in the way that the rallies were advertised, and certainly clear in the speeches on the day. Politically, I sort of get it, in that politicians would be looking at those polls that we mentioned and calculating that criticising the whole group of people would probably risk alienating them even further. But the counter-argument is that not criticising them is only exacerbating the alienation and fear in the diverse communities that are being targeted by these rallies. And I think there's a particular question about how the right-wing forces within the coalition are trying to tap into these rallies and really push the sort of false claim that this is actually representative of mainstream Australia, that, 99% of these people are just ordinary Aussies who are really angry about mass immigration and net zero, trying to really foment the same kind of natives agenda that is taking hold in the UK and the US. And I guess trying to sort of relive the voice referendum, which obviously wasn't relived in the general election, but trying to sort of find a way to tap in to that sentiment and I guess also challenge Susan Lee's move to take the coalition more to the centre. So I think that's a quite volatile factor that's sort of feeding into it in Australia.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that Labor, that the Prime Minister's rhetoric, at least initially, was a little bit kind of softer than you might expect when you've seen neo-Nazis on the street, that good people. I mean, I don't really see what Labor has to fear from these marches, who they think they're appealing to with that type of rhetoric. Like, we just had an election. Peter Dutton was the most sort of hardline, sort of tough on immigration leader the coalition has had in a long time. He was absolutely belted by the electorate. People were not interested in what he was selling. Labor has a mandate. They won with huge support from multicultural communities. Why they feel they even need to give the tiniest amount of ground to these marches, I don't really understand the political calculation there. And I think it's interesting that it's taken a couple of days, but you've seen more figures in Labor, which we've reported on, including Ed Husic coming out and saying, there is no such thing as a good fascist, and just calling this for what it is.
And just to dig into that a little bit more, there are some politicians who are trying to continue this debate, I guess, for want of a better word. What have they been doing?
Yeah, I mean, they're doing what the politicians always do in these scenarios, which is, and also the protesters and the neo-Nazis do it as well, which is to kind of try and create stunts, create a controversy to keep attention on the issue. So, Jacinta Price and Pauline Hanson wore flags to Parliament, and that created a story. Jacinta Price incorrectly and falsely accused the government of trying to bring in more Indian migrants. And I think somehow the Indian community has been particularly targeted in all of this. And then she had to walk that back, but I don't think that would have mattered to her because she got two headlines out of it. The neo-Nazi crashed a press conference with the Victorian Premier. Again, that's all over the news. There were some National Party ministers who crossed the floor to support a Pauline Hanson attempt to set up a Senate inquiry into mass migration and its impacts. I mean, whatever happened to Ron Boswell, who used to call these things out for what they are? Like, what's the National Party come to? And then in the background, I think, of a lot of the things in the coalition is Tony Abbott, who is very much playing a role behind the scenes to try to pull the coalition to the right. And so I think all of that, it means that the issue stays in the headlines, and it does set up a question for the media about how we report it, because it drowns out a whole lot of other things that happened in Parliament this week. It kind of gives these ideas possibly attention beyond what they probably deserve.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been a very interesting week, I think, to be editing the news and thinking about to what extent are you platforming really dangerous ideas, to what is the news that you have to cover, what is the news that you don't cover. That's something we've really wrestled with here, and it's made all the harder when it's happening in Parliament. Like, it's easier to say, all right, we're not going to cover the NSN, the neo-Nazi groups carrying out stunts on the street or marching up and down the street of a town. That's fine. It's much harder to say we're just going to ignore something happening on the floor of a Parliament over and over again. And I think that's part of a kind of a far-right strategy, I think, is getting politicians on board. Like, the far-right is probably very pleased to see some politicians taking up their message. It's notable that even before the anti-immigration marches took place, there were a number of politicians who ended up speaking at them, who were urging people to join, putting out videos. Bob Katter, who's often treated as a sort of lovable, quirky, maverick MP, was out there, I think, on YouTube.
And it's quite a well-worn tactic, right? I mean, it's the tactic that Donald Trump used in 2016 to just say anything outrageous, do anything outrageous to keep in the news, to highlight his issues. And I guess now it's more difficult for us to just ignore groups because a lot of these groups can get to a certain level of attention off their own bat via social media, via all sorts of channels. And then we're in a situation where there are marches led by neo-Nazis walking down the street. And that's a news story. You can't ignore that. Like, that's something that people want to know about and want explained to them. And so you have to think about how to explain that without really platforming or increasing attention to the ideas and the views. So, which is obviously what the extremists want you to do. So you need to not give them airtime, not interview them, not sugarcoat what are really extreme ideas, call them for what they are. And I think the other thing that's really important is to talk to the people who are harmed by these ideas. So I think Ben Doherty's story about the Palestinians who were allegedly bashed in the train after these rallies, or Steph Convery's stories about the school teacher who was allegedly bashed on Sunday afternoon in Melbourne. We're going to run a story about how the Indian community is feeling because they're so targeted. I mean, these things have real impacts on members of the community, and I think just kind of, well, they're ordinary folk, a bit concerned, can gloss over what this means to a large number of Australians who are really afraid.
And those are real material impacts on people's lives that you're talking about. And we can't talk about the media as a monolith here. There has been different strands of coverage, but what types of coverage have we seen over the past week in the different sections?
I guess a couple of other egregious things that Lenore sort of mentioned, but that I was quite shocked about, were things like running Tom Sewell, who's the most prominent neo-Nazi leader in Australia, his speech in full. So not just at the rally, but then also when he confronted Jacinta Allen days later. I think a lot of media, that was something that I felt we had to cover. We made a conscious decision when we grabbed the video of that not to include the audio of what he was saying, because he was spouting absolute nonsense. It was a propaganda moment for him, and that wasn't something we wanted to kind of do his work for him by clipping up and putting that online and spreading that speech. I saw some other media outlets did. I mean, there are other media outlets that just straight up interview these guys and spread that. I mean, what a PR coup for the far right. I can't believe those kinds of mistakes are still being made. Like, how many times do we need to learn the lessons that in doing that kind of thing, you're never going to win as the media interviewing a neo-Nazi. You are doing the work for them. But unfortunately, that message does not seem to have got through to a lot of our colleagues. There's another type of commentary that I also find a bit disturbing, though, which is not the straight out platforming of neo-Nazis and, what I would deem as explicitly racist coverage. But I feel like there's also a lot of kind of pussyfooting commentary, frankly, around the need to have these important debates about immigration in ways that I think are really dehumanising to the people affected by those debates. And these tend to come from more sort of centrist white commentators in Australia, with a complete disregard for what talking about, frankly, the sort of the worth and humanity of migrants, of Indigenous people to this country are. These people don't have to deal with the impacts of that, whether that's just the emotional impact of seeing you and your community talked about that, or the potential for violence that fomenting those ideas and those debates has. There are communities in Australia that live with the threat of racist violence who think about people like Brenton Tarrant, who take these ideas to their most extreme. And I would just, I guess, ask colleagues in our industry to really think about, when you're saying we need an open debate about immigration, what are the parameters of the debate? Who's affected by the debate? Who profits from that debate?
I think there's some in the media who have taken the debate edging up pretty close to the Great Replacement theory and very extreme kinds of ideas. I was kind of shocked by a column from Adam Creighton in The Australian where he kind of hid behind ChatGPT, but he posed a question to ChatGPT saying, if Australia's government wanted to covertly erase the nation's British, Irish, European heritage, would the immigration program look much like one in existence today? And the answer he was shocked to find from ChatGPT was, yes, it would look strikingly similar. So, he's trying to hide behind ChatGPT, but he's basically making the point that the migration program is trying to erase the country's British heritage, which is, I think, well beyond the parameters of a debate about migration. The editorial in The Australian edged towards similar things when it said that the people in the mostly peaceful marches were expressing concerns about the impact of high levels of immigration, and it sent an uncomfortable message, which was not necessarily about immigration or multiculturalism. It was about an increasingly fractured community cohesion and sense of alienation that many people feel from what was once a common or shared Australian identity. I'm not sure what shared identity they're talking about, if not the one that excludes the migrants. Like maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but that's what it looks like to me. So this is also skirting right up against ideas that are really on the very fringe of these debates.
And when things like that have been published, that's not a blog. That's the national broadsheet that's been published in. Just going back to the government, in this climate, they've announced that so-called NZYQ group will be transferred to Nauru. Do you think the government's immigration policies are being driven in part by the sentiment that we saw in the weekend's protests?
I mean, I think the government is, and probably always has been, worried about how this debate can take off, worried about how community sentiment can be stoked in these areas. And, you know, as we've been saying, there's a long, long history of that going back decades. So they announced this $400 million program to send people to Nauru, a group of people who were basically facing indefinite detention because their visas had been cancelled. Then the High Court said that they couldn't be in indefinite detention, but they can't be sent back to their home countries. So the government's effectively paying Nauru to take these people away. An enormous amount of money. They're having to legislate to overturn or get around procedural fairness in order to do that. The fact that they're prepared to go to those lengths and pay that amount of money, I think speaks to a fear about how the community views these issues, a fear about what might happen were some of these people had previously been convicted of certain crimes. If they were to commit another crime, how that could be used in this time. I think it is a sign that the government is concerned, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess just picking up on what I said before about how, you know, the election showed that Australians don't want to embrace the sort of rhetoric and policies on immigration that Peter Dutton was pushing. I guess the flip side of that is that Australia has already absorbed into the mainstream some very hardline policies on immigration that would be regarded as sitting right on the fringes of the right in a lot of other countries. Like, you know, we all remember Donald Trump saying to Malcolm Turnbull, like, you're worse than we are, when he heard about our policies of boat turnbacks and offshore detention. Like Australia, the centre of Australian politics is already really where the sort of right is on a lot of issues related to immigration and has been for most of, you know, the last couple of decades, really, since the Tampa affair. So I definitely think the government has that in mind.
So keeping all of this in mind, everything that we've just discussed, and we've gone to a lot of different places, how concerned do you think we should be about the rise of the far right in Australia?
I think we need to be vigilant and very thoughtful about how we report on it as the media. I think politicians need to be vigilant and thoughtful about how they react to it. But as Joe was saying earlier, I think we also need to remember that Australians actually expressed their opinions pretty forcefully, 4 or 5 months ago, and it was not in support of these kind of ideas. So I think we need to be vigilant and careful, but we need to keep it in perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's right. But I think we can also look overseas. Look at what's happened to the US. Like if you go from where you thought the sort of broader American view was, say, during the Obama years on issues of race and immigration, to what's happening in the US now with ICE, with Trump, things can spiral out of hand pretty quickly if those ideas are mainstreamed. And I guess that's a sort of question both for the media and political class in this country of where do you want this debate to go? Are you willing to bring it into the mainstream, or are we willing to kind of defeat the true moral evil of racism? And I think people aren't grappling with it as it is a completely corrosive, moral evil to allow the dehumanization of people based on their race to fester in society. And frankly, I just can't believe how the lack of alarm that some people have had this week in response to those rallies. And I think that's something we need to reflect on and do much better on.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads. Joe, what was it this week for you?
So, yeah, a bit of a step change. But for me, I was really delighted by a story it's a story about The Guardian, I have to say, about a Guardian headline that went viral and has taken on a new life. So Rebecca Shaw, who's a brilliant feminist comedian from Australia, wrote a piece for us about the likes of Elon Musk and the kind of tech bros ruining the world with the headline, "I knew that one day I'd have to watch powerful men burn the world down. I just didn't expect them to be such losers." And that headline went completely viral. The piece was brilliant. And we just learned this week that an alt folk artist by the name of Paris Paloma, I've never heard of her before, I have to admit, is releasing a new single that features a cameo from British actor Emma Thompson reading that headline. Apparently Emma was a huge fan of the piece. So, yeah, just really great to see.
That column has had an extraordinary life.
It's
incredible. Yeah.
And Lenore, what was it for you?
I'm kind of looking for a bit of joy in this news cycle, I've got to say. And it came in the form of a piece on the Common People Dance of Stedford, which is part of the Brisbane Festival. It's now in its 7th year. It invites people of all ages, sizes and abilities to dance together to 80s and 90s music, yes, while wearing leotard, sequins, sparkles and glitter. And then there's a dance-off as part of the Brisbane Festival. And one of the inaugural participants calls it dickhead dancing. And I'm there for it. I reckon it sounds great.
I'm absolutely here for doing something for the fun of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me this week, Lenore.
Thanks, Brady.
And thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Brady.